Welcome back to the Discover podcast, where we view faith as a discovery journey with Jesus to help you become the person God created you to be. Hey everybody, welcome back to this episode of the Discover podcast. You know, where we've been for the majority of this season has been talking to different congregation members in our church to specifically hear their story and how God is meeting them and how God has met them and where He's brought them in their spiritual journey up to this point. We thought for the last stretch of this season, we'd kind of shift gears a little bit and talk to some different counselors, therapists, and spiritual directors about the shape and development of people's stories as it pertains to different issues that they see in their counseling work. I mean, the reality is everybody's story is broken, and one of the ways that we hope to find healing in our stories is through reaching out to people who can help us process trauma, grief, loss, shame, hurt, broken relationships. And so through these next few episodes, we're going to be sitting down with some therapists, some who go to our church, some we just know from out in the community, and they're going to talk from a faith perspective, how processing these things, how working through these issues can help us become the person that God has designed us to be. So in this episode, we're sitting down with my friend Tyler Loomis, who is a former pastor and now a full-time therapist, specifically to talk about trauma and grief and how they shape our story and how, if they go unprocessed in our life, how it can impact the development of our story. So if you're in a place of grief, if you're in a place of processing any sort of trauma in your life, while this is just an entry-level conversation, I do think it will be helpful for you. Thanks for joining, and hopefully this is an encouragement. Yeah, there's this one toy that in this room.
It always wants to chime in.
Yeah. So
the toy's like, I've got a thought here.
Yeah, we need to remember that for next time. Yeah. Anyway, you can keep that in if you want it in the episode. Well, hey there. Welcome back to this episode of the Discover podcast. I'm sitting here today with my friend Tyler Loomis, and Tyler's been coming to our church for a while, and he's here not just as a congregation member, but also as a therapist. So why don't you give us a little bit, introduce yourself, give us some of your background, maybe a little bit of the makeup of your family, where you're at in life, and then we'll go from there.
So I am currently a full-time therapist. Prior to that, I was served in a pastoral role for 25 years. I was doing both for a while and then transitioned into full-time therapy in 2017. And I've been married coming up on 29 years, and we have 5 kids that are ages 15 to 25. So,
nice. Yeah. So did you get you have a degree for counseling?
Yep.
And did you get that somewhere along the way during your pastoral experience, or did you have that even before you became a pastor?
No, so I started in youth ministry, and I did that for about 8 or 9 years, and then I just felt like I wanted to be better equipped for all the stuff that comes, that pastors have on their plates, and so that led me to a counseling degree. So it's a master's in counseling psychology.
Yep.
And then when I finished that, I came back on staff at our church in the role of pastoral care.
Right.
But it was also a licensable degree,
Right.
by the state. So it's an LPC.
So when you got that degree, did you have any idea, maybe someday down the road I'll be a therapist full time, or was that like just a distant, I wasn't even thinking that?
Did not. I wanted to have something that got me outside of the ministry and the church context.
Yeah.
But I didn't really envision myself doing what I'm doing now. I thought I'd be on a church staff until I retired.
Yeah. So those two jobs, there's a lot of overlap, obviously. Yeah. But also a whole lot of differences in what you do as a pastor and a therapist.
Yes.
And so tell us just real quick about your own spiritual journey from the standpoint of how have you found this life that you live now as a therapist different from what you did as a pastor, just from the standpoint of your own relationship with the Lord? We don't have to go deep into that. But,
Yeah. The first word that comes to mind is easier. It was, the pastoral role was difficult in as far as it's hard to have boundaries around it. It's who are your friends, who are your church attenders?
Yep.
Who are your mentors? Who, so it was in some ways a lot more complex.
Yeah.
And I think I got to move out of, I don't know if you ever feel like this, but God sometimes feels like an idea that you're peddling.
Yeah, right.
As opposed to someone that you're actually just in a relationship with for yourself.
Yeah.
And then for the community. But so in a lot of ways, I'd say since 2017, it's easier.
That's interesting. It's funny to me, like never knowing life, not being a pastor. There will come a day when I'm no longer a pastor. And I think now that I'm in my 40s, I'm just like, I wonder what that will be like. So I'm just curious. We're not here to talk about that today necessarily, but that just came to mind. We are here to talk about the idea of trauma and grief within someone's story. We've been on this journey of just hearing stories from people in our church as we've launched this Storytellers Initiative from Psalm 107, verse 2, let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story. So just trying to help people like get a handle on, what is my own story? And so we've had people on the podcast just sharing their story specifically from their spiritual journey. And so we now are entering into this part of this season where we're talking to therapists, because if there's somebody who understands, I think, the development of people's stories and sees people at different points along their journey, it's a therapist who's trying to help guide them so that they can have a very healthy, wholehearted, full story. And so we're reaching out to therapists, you being one of them, in part because you go to our church, just saying, hey, what would be a topic that you think would be helpful for people to think through? And you suggested trauma and grief. So tell me why those two ideas came to mind for you when I asked you if you wanted to be on this.
I think to start out with, because they're universal. Loss and grief is the great equalizer. There's not a person, age, race, income, status, whatever, that has not or will not experience some type of significant loss. Grief and trauma can often feel very much the same. There's a lot of overlap between the two. Where I think there's a difference. I think there is some grief and some loss that's not traumatic. However, I think all trauma involves some type of loss. Whether it's a loss of safety, loss of a loved one, loss of some, health issue or whatever. But so I think the two are very closely related as far as what we go through and how we process them.
It's interesting that this idea of trauma is becoming a more normalized idea and term in our society. So I've been a part of this preaching cohort, and we had this little teaching just a couple of weeks ago talking about trauma-informed preaching. That was never a term I heard in seminary.
I have not heard that one. Okay.
And so for me, it was like this wake-up call of like trauma-informed preaching. Like I have to now like think about preaching in a whole new light. I actually appreciated what this little teaching shared because I thought it was helpful. But as we think about trauma being a more universal word, where do you find that is helpful, and where do you find that can be confusing for people?
Well, it's definitely one of those words that's in a category of overused. We hear words like trauma, bullying, narcissism, gaslighting. Like those terms are way overused, and trauma specifically, people are using the word for things that are not traumatic. I sat in traffic for 20 minutes. I was so traumatized. Now, that's not traumatizing unless perhaps that person had been in a very bad car accident in the middle of traffic, and they're being reminded of all of that. But in general, that's not traumatizing. Or my boss yelled at me today. I was so traumatized. Like being corrected by an authority is not traumatizing. So we're applying the label to things sometimes that are not traumatizing, which does take away from things that actually are.
So how would you characterize and define what trauma is, kind of from a more clinical, technical standpoint?
Can I use a cheat sheet here?
Yeah, please.
So couple definitions that I looked at, and one is the word trauma literally means wound, shock, or injury. And so back when it was becoming more of, when like PTSD was becoming a diagnosis in the mental health world, it often had to do with bodily harm. Things like abuse, car accidents, crime, natural disasters. But the definition is expanded to more psychological trauma, and that can be an event that overwhelms a person's capacity to emotionally digest it. It can be a one-time event, or it can be a series of occurrences perceived as seriously harmful or life-threatening to oneself or loved ones. So it's not as much or limited to just being harmed physically. It can also involve being harmed emotionally, and it creates just a very dramatic response in a person that they really didn't plan on, and suddenly it's just there in front of them.
Yeah. So talk about that idea of like traumatic response, because I do think when it comes to the idea of PTSD, although I think a lot of people don't really understand it from the standpoint of they haven't experienced it. I don't think I could really articulate the experience of it. I don't think I've really lived it. But I think people do have this understanding of sometimes, or at least they have an awareness. Again, I don't know if they have an understanding because they haven't experienced it, but sometimes situations you're in now trigger these thoughts or memories from a season of life prior, and that's like, I think they would say you're being re-traumatized. And so how do you think of those ideas within the scope of the development of one's story, as we're talking about like people's stories and how they process life in moments where they are, either re-traumatized or reliving some painful thing from the past?
Yeah. Well, as far as the development of a story, unresolved grief have the potential to get a person stuck. And getting unstuck involves the processing of triggers. Most people who've been traumatized, who've experienced some kind of significant loss, they don't wake up in the morning saying, I hope I'm reminded of that event today.
Yeah.
I hope I get triggered today.
Yeah.
However, they come. The triggers come. And people who learn to process those get unstuck. People who don't tend to get stuck, or they have a significant part of their life that gets walled off. A great example of this, Charles Dickens' novel, Great Expectations. There's Miss Havisham. She is a young woman. She's jilted at the altar. The day of her wedding, the guy never shows up.
Yeah.
From that point forward, she never takes off her wedding dress. She is walking around with one shoe. She goes back home. She doesn't take care of her house. She leaves all the clocks at the time of the wedding. She doesn't reset them. And she's essentially stuck in that moment of being jilted, which that's a traumatic event.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting because this is, Charles Dickens. I mean, we didn't have language for trauma or PTSD, but he captures it so well, because what she goes on to do is Pip, the main character in the story, is falling in love with her daughter, and she's trying to set up her daughter to break his heart because men are trash.
Right.
You can't trust them. You should hurt them.
Yeah.
And so she's stuck not only in that moment, but she's also stuck in her perspective about men or romantic relationships. And so that part of her gets walled off because she was never able to go through the grief process, work through the trauma of being jilted.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. So typically when I think of trauma, like I think of more like abuse, kind of like you talked about earlier, some sort of physical, so to see it in light of like that would, I don't know how you would characterize that as like maybe an emotional wound, maybe also a psychological wound.
Yep.
But I think a lot of people tend to think of trauma as abuse. And in that moment, from that story, she's defined now necessarily by her trauma and can't move beyond it.
Yeah. So it does, like, I think the definition of trauma also has to be somewhat fluid, because what one person experiences traumatic, another person might not.
Yeah.
We lived in a neighborhood with a pretty high crime rate for a while, and I one night saw two people shooting at each other out of their cars. They were probably 5 or 10 feet away from me. I slept fine that night.
Yeah.
That was not traumatizing for me at all. Don't know why, but it just wasn't. But for someone else, they would pack up and leave that night and never go back.
Yeah.
And so it's hard to label a specific type of event as traumatic. It's more about a person's response to it.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. So if you go back to your example earlier around like being reprimanded by a boss or whatever, like that's not necessarily trauma, but somebody would want to say, oh, but that is traumatic. That is hurtful for me. Why would you say like that's not necessarily trauma in and of itself?
I think the first thing is because it's an everyday part of life.
Got it.
Receiving correction from an authority figure, whether it's a parent, whether it's a boss, a coach, that's a pretty normal part of life. Traumatic events, significant loss, they're in a different category.
Yeah.
They don't happen to us every day.
Yeah. Yeah. I.e. getting left at the altar from the story.
Yeah.
So for you, as you think of like this idea of somebody getting stuck, so if I don't process trauma, I can get stuck. And maybe that's not like the woman in Great Expectation. Like we're not walking around with a wedding dress or whatever the thing is, but it could be that we get stuck in other ways.
Yep.
How have you seen in your work as a therapist the ways that people get stuck?
One of the ways that I've seen this is people go through something traumatic, some kind of loss, and we can create a vow for ourselves, either consciously or subconsciously. But a vow is like, I'll never trust men again. Or say it involves some type of racism. You have one person from one race saying, I will never trust a person from that race again.
Yep.
Because of what I went through.
Yep.
That you're essentially walling yourself off from people, from other races, from other classes. Church.
Yeah.
People have had significant, relational abuse, relational brokenness as a result of the church. I will never step foot in a church again. That it's understandable.
Yeah.
But that can keep a person stuck if they're making a vow to never or always, because there aren't many nevers or alwayses we want to make in life.
Yeah. Are there other ways that you see? I think that's a really good way to classify what it means to get stuck. Are there other ways you see it manifest itself in people's lives?
I think people can also get emotionally stuck, where I don't feel much of anything. I don't want to feel sad or scared or hopeless because of this loss. It feels safer to feel nothing.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to kind of go through life as flatlined as possible.
Yeah.
The problem with that is it usually ends up coming out as anger.
Yeah.
And, you just have, the person with the proverbial anger issues, that it can come out sideways in all sorts of ways.
Yeah. Yeah. So we've been talking a little bit about trauma, and obviously I would understand how grief would be connected to trauma, but not all grief is necessarily going to be trauma. Would you say that's true?
Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So let's spend a little bit of time talking about this idea of grief and how that specifically can impact somebody's story, and what is the result of people not processing their grief, and kind of, how does grief then manifest itself in people's lives as well?
Yeah. Well, again, they're similar in that I think they both involve, in order to heal, the processing of triggers.
Yeah.
But grief is going to be more common than trauma.
Mm-hmm.
I think a person maybe could go through their life without experience a traumatic event, but we all experience significant loss.
Yeah.
And knowing how do we handle loss is crucial.
Mm-hmm.
And the gospel has a lot to say about that. I mean, the theme of loss, lament, that's strong within Scripture.
Yeah.
And does give us a pathway for how to deal with our grief, but we have to deal with it.
Yeah. It's interesting that for both of those, for trauma and grief, you talked about triggers, right? So like triggers for trauma are going to maybe bring you back to that moment where you had all those emotional feelings that you did in the moment you were traumatized. What would that be like for grief? Like, what would be a grief trigger? Because I think of grief in terms of, some people will talk about, these waves of grief that come on me unexpected. Maybe that's a similar idea, but how would you describe what that is from a trigger standpoint with grief?
Yeah, so my first experience with significant loss was our second pregnancy. Was a 9-month stillborn. My wife, she's a NICU nurse. She was at Waukesha Memorial at the time that they discovered, she was at work, that there was no heartbeat. And so I got a call at 2 a.m, drive out to the hospital. We go through the, she had to give birth and
you said she was working at the time?
She was working at the time.
Oh,
yep.
Gosh.
Yep. Yeah, because her nursing, she's kind of like, I don't know if I've felt the baby move much recently, and she's right at the end of the term, and so one of her friends just got this little portable ultrasound unit and brought it up, and they're like, and so they had her admitted into a room and brought in the regular ultrasound machine, and it was confirmed that there was no heartbeat. And there was a knot in the umbilical cord, and as the baby moved down, the knot just slowly tightened. And there's no way to know that was ever going to happen. And so went through all of that. I mean, that was obviously really hard. But so an interesting thing that they do at the hospital when a family has experienced the loss of a baby, this was at Waukesha Memorial, they put a little card on the outside of the door, and it has a leaf with a raindrop on it. Picture of a leaf with a raindrop. And what that does is it alerts the staff that the family's gone through a loss, so don't come in with the words of congratulations or excitement and how's everybody doing? Like, they just know, like, you're walking into a place of grief, And so about a year later, some friends of ours had a baby and needed some minor surgery at Children's. And we were walking up to go visit them. And in the room next to theirs, Children's does the same thing. There's that card.
That same image?
That same card. Yep. I knew what was happening in that room to a certain extent. And that just, in that moment, it just hit me. Like it all came back. So I just took a minute to sit in the waiting room, 20, 30 seconds, just felt what I needed to feel, and then went and visited our friends. But that is an example of a trigger. no idea that was coming.
Yeah.
It was like a year later.
Yep.
And
would you classify that situation? Thanks for telling that
Yeah,
story,
yeah.
by the way. Would you classify that situation or the story of your loss as trauma as well as grief?
it's probably, I think for me, for us, the two of us, it was probably more in the grief category.
Okay.
I think for someone else that could be traumatic.
Yeah.
But I felt like we didn't really have those strong like fight or flight freeze moments that trauma triggers can create. So that was definitely more of an example of plain old grief
Yeah.
just getting triggered.
Yeah. Sometimes I wonder, based on that, like maybe you don't realize you've been traumatized until you experience a
Yep.
trigger, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, what is this?
Yeah,
Right?
yeah,
I mean, because with
absolutely.
grief and loss, you probably know, like, oh, I know why I'm feeling this way, you
Yep,
know?
yep.
But trauma might catch you by surprise at times.
Yeah.
I mean, grief does as well.
Right,
But again, you
right.
may not realize I've been traumatized until I experience a trigger.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So what would you say in terms of, we're talking about like, hey, like in order to like move beyond whether trauma or grief, like you have to process what you said a couple times, process your triggers. Let's talk about that a
Yep.
little bit
Yep.
and how somebody even begins to think about that in terms of, because there's probably people who are tuning in, like who are definitely, I know that there are people in our church who are experiencing grief. I also know that there are people in our church who have experienced trauma, and they could be very well listening, like, yeah, like I'm tracking with what you're saying, but I don't know what to do.
Yeah. Yep. The processing is so one way to think about it, especially with trauma, there can be overreactions and underreactions. An overreaction is the person believes and behaves like it's happening all over again. It's all the same. And the classic example is you get the soldier who comes home from the war, and
Yeah.
he's sitting in the comfort of his home, and maybe a door slams in the other room, and he's on the ground, his gun is drawn, he's looking for the enemy.
Yeah.
Because for him, he's in it's all the same.
Yeah.
But that's an overreaction because there's no enemy and he's not in any harm.
Yep.
Now, in that moment, could he help it? Probably not. But as he processes what happened, he's like he could look later on and go, yeah, that was an overreaction because I didn't need to draw my gun. I didn't need to be looking for the enemy. We can have underreactions where it's like, trigger? What trigger? I'm fine. And I could have done that at the hospital. Maybe brushed it off and pretended,
Stuffed it down.
Yep.
Yeah.
Pretended I didn't see it or didn't feel anything. But we only have so much room to stuff
Yeah.
things
Stuff.
down. Yeah, to stuff our stuff. And so I think in that middle ground, you've got a processing of a trigger where it's like, okay, what am I feeling right now? And where's that coming from? What is it reminding me of? What do I need? What do I need to do? What are my options? And so when you're asking yourself that, or even talking to someone else about it, you are processing a trigger, and that actually helps you heal. So I sit down in that hospital waiting room. What am I feeling? Well, I'm sad. I'm being reminded of what happened to us a year ago.
Yeah.
What do I need to do? I think I just need to sit right now.
Yeah.
I just need to sit and remember and think about how I'm feeling and feel it.
Yeah.
And in that process, healing happens.
Yeah. So sometimes when you have these emotional responses, emotional reactions to things, like people don't have the clarity or the wherewithal to ask those few questions, like, what am I feeling? What do I need? So how does somebody even get to that place where they can like have that ability to do that?
If they can't do it in the moment, sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. It's having the, I guess, willingness to look back
Yeah.
and just ask yourself, and this is where therapy or a good friend or whatever can help. Like, ask yourself, like, what was happening for me there?
Yeah.
I had another situation, and I don't know if this falls in grief or trauma or which one, but I had a client that was not happy with how a session went.
Okay.
With her and her husband, and they were a Christian couple, and I got an email later on that day about the session, and I poked at her a little bit, not unfairly, and not out of wanting to provoke anything, but just to be honest with her, and just this email came, and it provoked all sorts of stuff in me, and so I talked about it with my colleague after the weekend, and as we were talking about it, I realized it was reminding me of seasons of being a pastor and getting these lengthy email complaints. Like, I'd get on a Friday afternoon.
Yeah.
It would ruin my whole weekend.
Yeah.
Because what am I going to do with this? And how do I respond? And this person's unhappy. And that email from that client felt like that.
Yeah, interesting.
And so it was good just to be able to go like, okay, why was that so troubling to me?
Yeah.
It's one email from one client. Why is that bothering me so much? So it was good to be able to look back and go, okay, I think that's what that's about.
Yeah, and so, it sounds like even in that situation, you may not have been carrying any mental awareness that, like, I have, whether it's unresolved grief or unresolved anger or whatever about, like, my past experience with the way that people treated me or interacted me with when I was a pastor. But this email, like, brought all that up.
Yep.
And what could have been another way, hypothetically speaking, if you didn't go through that, if you didn't process that, if you didn't talk to your colleague about it, if you didn't sit with it and be curious about it.
Yep.
At some level, you have to be curious about
Absolutely.
how you're responding to these things. What could have been another outcome to how that could have furthered your own, like, story within the moment or within that next week? And then what could have been the end result of that if you did not... I'm asking you to play a little pretend here, but can you kind of, like, think that through? Like, here's how that could have played out differently had I not spent the time to really sit in that and be curious about it and process it.
Right. Well, I think that gets us back to that idea of stuckness.
Yeah.
Where I'm letting something as, I get small as an email, steal my joy. And if I would have just pushed it down and tried to move on quickly, that's fine maybe for a little while until it happens again.
Yeah. Whether it's from that same person or a different client.
Yep, exactly. And what can happen then is we're giving away parts of our lives, parts of our peace of mind to people that don't even know that they're doing that. And so I think being able to, like, pause, be curious, what was that about, process that, it does make a person stronger for the next round, whatever that might be.
Yeah. Because I would wonder if you don't process that, it starts to create a pattern of whether it's anger and frustration. Because you mentioned that earlier, right?
Yep.
Like, oftentimes unprocessed, maybe it was grief or trauma, can come out as anger because it's just, I'm angry about this thing.
Yeah. And
I'm not going to be curious about why I'm angry. I'm just going to be angry.
And
then that starts to form your character over time.
Yeah. Because anger is very protective. It keeps people at an arm's length. We get stuff done when we're angry. And I heard somewhere that anger is the bodyguard of grief. And that stuck with me from the moment I heard it, and it makes so much sense.
Yeah.
We put anger out there
because we don't want to be sad.
Yep.
We don't want to feel loss.
We don't have time for that.
Right. And so if I just get angry and run over somebody or push somebody out of my way, then I don't have to deal with the sadness that I'm feeling.
Yep. At least I'm getting stuff done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So how would you articulate, you kind of alluded to it, like if we don't spend the time to process like these triggers or whatever can steal our joy, describe some other outcomes for people and what they can become if they spend time processing both grief and joy.
Yeah.
I mean, grief and trauma.
Yeah. I think, so it's a good question to ask is, what is God wanting to form in me through the experiences I've had?
Yeah.
And at its best, I think grief and trauma can create a humility. It can create a compassion. If the verse in Romans, weep with those who weep.
Yep.
And celebrate with those who celebrate. If people don't know what that means, if they've never done it, going through loss and processing it well, that gives you an inroad to really weep with those who weep.
Yeah.
And it just creates a humility because you just realize how small you are, sometimes how powerless you are, and so you look at someone else. There's no judgment there. Then it's just like they are going through something that they might not be responsible for. They feel small. They feel powerless.
Yeah.
Maybe helpless. Maybe hopeless. And when you've been there, it really gives you an ability to connect with others. And so it can really create, just open up a new pathway into your soul.
Yep.
If you allow it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. So I got two questions, and we'll wind down with these two questions. Earlier you said maybe at the beginning of the conversation, trauma and grief is a great equalizer. Yep. Somewhere also along the way, you kind of alluded to Scripture has a lot to say about how we kind of navigate or how we experience that. Or I'm not quite sure what you were alluding to, but I'm curious. I don't know if you remember the other thoughts that you had that I didn't really pull out of you. Just curious, say a little bit more about that, about how we think about our faith in light of trauma and grief, and how we meet God in those moments.
Yeah. Well, I guess I would start out with the unhealthy ways that I've experienced faith and grief intersecting. And I think we can be in a hurry. We can hurry other people along. Like God is faithful, you must be doing better now.
Yeah.
As if someone's still struggling, God is not faithful.
Yeah.
And so we throw scriptures at people. We want them to feel better. As people, we don't like feeling powerless, and sitting next to someone who is going through something really hard and you can't take it away. That's powerless.
Yeah.
And so we'll do something. We'll say something. We'll scramble.
Right.
We'll throw a Bible verse out there.
Almost to make ourselves feel better rather than actually trying to help them in any way.
Yeah. And so what people, whether they're doing it to themselves or to other people, what they're forgetting is that the Bible is full of people who lost, who wept, who were confused, who were anguished, who shook their fist at God, who the honest prayers of what are you doing and why and where is all of this going? And a few years ago, Michael Card wrote a book called The Sacred Sorrow, The Lost Language of Lament. And such a rich book, just bringing readers back to the fact that that's a theme throughout Scripture, and we need to have the patience to lean into that theme and not be moving ourselves or other people along too soon.
Yep. That's interesting that you talk about lament, like that's a natural thing to do in the midst of grief.
Yep.
And I don't think the church today has a category for that. Like
Right.
the church has not done a good job. And I speak to myself in this, meaning like maybe as a pastor, I've neglected that part of development and formation to say, yes, I mean, there's the book called Lamentations, right?
Yeah.
To say
Yep.
that's a natural part of life, is to lament those things we've lost when we try and hurry people along.
Yeah, and can we turn those into prayers? We can write our own psalms.
Yeah.
For stuff that we're going through, because we have our own questions, we have our own anguish, we have our own confusion, we have our own I don't like this moments, and we're allowed to have those. I mean,
Right.
the what's put out in front of us in Scripture is like we are allowed to have those moments, and God can meet us there.
Yeah. And it's almost like the good news can be cheapened if we don't allow people the space to grieve that loss and that trauma in order to get to that. Okay, here's where the good news is. Sometimes it's cheapened without that real, like, oh, I need to work through this before I can like really take hold of that. And sometimes we just want people to take hold of it too quickly.
Yep.
Not that we want people to like live in their grief and like almost like romanticize it or anything, but it does make the good news of the gospel and Jesus, I think, in the idea of all things being made new, that much more sweeter when we can really be like, okay, this is the reality I'm in, but yet this is what's coming.
Yeah, and we allow it to really settle in. We even in the church, we want our quick fixes.
Yeah.
And quick fixes usually aren't good fixes.
Yeah. So kind of a final question to say, okay, let's say somebody's listening and they are stuck in grief, or they find that they can't healthily engage with trauma triggers in their life. What are some real like what would be their like practical next steps of how you would like coach them to respond?
Don't isolate. Grief and sadness and depression, they're just like begging you to isolate yourself.
Yeah.
And the most important thing is don't isolate.
Yeah.
You have to find those safe people in your life to talk about things with. And sometimes if it's grief, it's on a practical level. I had a friend who lost her husband about 4 years ago to COVID. And I remember her saying she just gave herself one thing to do each day. Like what is the one thing I'm just going to do today?
Yeah.
Even if the rest of the day is a wash.
Yep.
I'm just going to give myself one thing. And that gave her some momentum.
Yep.
And she didn't isolate.
Yeah.
And so it's don't try to fix it alone.
One thing can turn into two things, which can turn into three things. Yeah. I do think that is the power of like in the day and age we live in with online church, and I can stream it from home. I think there's reason for that in terms of like we have people who can't literally get here physically because of health issues and stuff. So, but I think one of the things that we lose when we like use that as our main form of worship is we don't find community.
Right.
And there's something like I watch people come in here on Sundays, and there are days they never even enter into the sanctuary. They're just in the lobby, like chatting it up with people. Yeah. And I'm like, maybe that's what they need, and that's okay. Yeah. And this is a place to meet other people and meet God in the midst of that. And just to there are some people who, yes, they just sit in the lobby and I think they're paying attention and they're dialed in, but there's something about the relational connection that happens in the lobby near the cafe that they need more than anything. And that's okay. Like it's okay just to be physically present and feel like, okay, that was a win just to get to church today. And
absolutely.
Community is huge.
By design, the church at its best is a place for healing.
Yeah.
That should be one of the outcomes.
Yeah. I mean, it's the metaphor we use. I don't know if you've heard me say it before. It's the idea of the church being a hospital and a home.
Yeah.
It's this place where broken people can belong, and hopefully we meet people where they're at, and then we can journey with them to where God wants them to be in terms of their whole selves in a healthy place.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
I know that this is kind of for those who are listening who are or watching or whatever, who are like, okay, counseling sounds great, but it's like it can be pricey and it can be expensive. This is just a quick, and I'll probably say this a couple of times over the course of these sessions. Like, if you want counseling and you're in need of counseling, talk to us and we'll help you with it. I mean, it's a regular thing that we do, and I know you probably work with lots of churches who help their congregation members afford counseling so that they can get the help that they need. Because we want to see people get the help that we need. And you have a whole lot more training than I do. I'll be like, hey, good luck, try hard, go read your Bible, pray, but you have these skills that I don't have. Fortunately, I'm married to a therapist, so I know maybe
She's
a little bit
teaching
more.
you a few things.
Or maybe I know just enough to be dangerous. I don't know.
Don't sell yourself short.
But we want to help people, and so if you're listening and you're like, I would love to get counseling, I don't know where to start, and I don't know if I can afford it, talk to us, and we'll help you with it for sure.
Yeah, that's great.
So
that's great.
Hey, thanks so much for taking the time.
Glad to be here.
I mean, it's great to have you around our church. It's
Love
great
it.
for you to do this with us, and so we're just super grateful for you.
Yeah.
And so if people see you on a Sunday morning,
Yeah.
You're not in a therapy session, so they should not corner you to try and get free counseling from you from a church standpoint. But,
Right.
But I know that you would also love to meet people at our church.
Absolutely.
So,
Would love to meet people.
Yeah. So thanks for being here today.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Cool. All right, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Hopefully this was helpful and encouraging. We'd love for you to keep this conversation going with us. If you are in the midst of experiencing grief and trauma, know that we are here for you. We want to help you and do anything we can to bring you to where God wants you to be. We'll see you next time.